It is the late 8th century AD. A new force is rising in the north. Silent oars slice through the icy waters. The wind howls, filling sails bound for lands yet unspoiled. The world does not yet know their name, but soon the Vikings will shake the foundations of Europe. But here's the twist. Most people think the Viking Age was all about mindless raiding. That's wrong. It was about something far more profound. Exploration, trade, and a ruthless efficiency that would make them the dominant seafarers of the medieval world. Most civilizations built walls to protect themselves. The Vikings built ships to conquer the waves, and that changed everything. But what made them so effective? What was their secret? And why did they expand so suddenly? In this episode of Storm from the North, we will unravel how Viking shipbuilding mastery, their relentless pursuit of wealth, and their ability to navigate treacherous seas led to an age of dominance. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll never look at Vikings the same way again. The Viking Age was not built on the axe, it was built on the ship. The longships of the Norse were not just vessels, they were instruments of power, conquest, and survival. Unlike the massive cogs and galleys of later medieval powers, Viking ships were designed with adaptability in mind. Their shallow hulls allowed them to sail in the open sea while being light enough to be carried overland. They could navigate shallow rivers, striking deep into continental Europe, and they could land almost anywhere, avoiding traditional ports or defences. Jan Bill, Professor of Viking Age Archaeology at the University of Oslo and curator of the Viking Ship Museum in the book The Viking World, edited by Stefan Brink and Neil Price, explains, state formation was dependent on ships, as only with ships some degree of control could be exercised over the populated coastal stretches of Norway and Sweden. The Vikings mastered a revolutionary shipbuilding technique known as clinker-built construction. By overlapping planks of wood along the hull, they created a flexible yet strong structure capable of withstanding the violent storms of the North Atlantic. This method also allowed their ships to move swiftly through water, a crucial advantage in both trade and warfare. But the longship was just one part of the Viking fleet. These Norse seafarers developed different vessels, each serving a unique purpose. The longship, or drakar, was the ultimate weapon of Viking warfare. Built for speed and stealth, these vessels enabled the hit-and-run tactics that made the Vikings the terror of medieval Europe. The longship's shallow draft meant it could sail up rivers deep into enemy territory, appearing in places no one expected. With its narrow, elongated design, it could move faster than almost any other vessel of its time. These ships were not just tools of war, they were symbols of power. The most elaborate longships featured carved dragon heads and intricate patterns meant to intimidate enemies and ward off spirits. Commanding a longship was a mark of prestige reserved for the most powerful Viking leaders. While the longship brought fear, the Nar brought wealth. The Nar was the Viking merchant vessel, built for endurance rather than speed. Wider and deeper than the longship, it was designed to carry large cargo loads over vast distances. Not every Viking needed a warship or a trade vessel. The Kavi was the workhorse of Viking society. These smaller boats were used for fishing, local transport, and even coastal raids. Judith Jesch, Professor of Viking Studies at the University of Nottingham, in Ships and Men in the Late Viking Age. The Viking world was one of movement and migration, where economic ambition was as strong a force as military conquest. This was the kind of vessel a simple farmer or fisherman might own, but in times of war the Kavi could still be used for quick skirmishes along the coast. Even the best ships were useless without skilled navigators. Unlike other medieval sailors who feared the open ocean, Vikings had an extraordinary ability to read nature and guide their way. Solar compasses allowed them to track the sun's position even on cloudy days, using sunstones made from Iceland's spar. Landmarks and ocean swells provided subtle cues about their location and direction. Bird navigation was another method. Vikings released ravens from their ships. If the birds returned, land was still far, but if they flew off in a straight line, land was near. Celestial navigation was also used, with the North Star serving as a constant guide. Viking ships were not just tools of war and trade, they were the economic backbone of Norse society. A well-built ship could make or break a chieftain's reputation. Neil Price, professor of archaeology at Uppsala University, in his book Children of Ash and Elm, A History of the Vikings. For the Vikings, a ship was more than a vessel. It was a means of survival, expansion, and an expression of power. Constructing a longship required over 15 different types of wood, each selected for different parts of the ship. Mastery of ship riveting and waterproofing, using tar and wool to keep vessels seaworthy. Extensive oral tradition, ensuring shipwrights passed down the secrets of Viking engineering. The image of a Viking is one of a warrior, fierce, axe in hand, his longship slicing through the waves, prepared to raid and pillage. But this is only half the truth. The Vikings were not just raiders, they were traders, diplomats, and settlers. They shaped the economic and political landscapes of medieval Europe as much with their commerce as with their conquests. Neil Price, professor of archaeology at Uppsala University, in Children of Ash and Elm, A History of the Vikings. For the Vikings, trade and raiding were two sides of the same coin. Both were pathways to wealth, status, and power. Unlike the nomadic warbands of later centuries, Viking expeditions were strategic and calculated. Some lands were too strong to conquer, but they could be profitable through trade. Others were too rich to ignore, making raids the more attractive option. So why did some Viking ships land peacefully to barter, while others arrived with fire and steel? The answer lies in economics, politics, and opportunity. The common belief is that Vikings raided because they were inherently violent, but history tells a more complex story. The Viking homeland, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, was rich in forests and coastline, but lacked arable land and valuable metals. As populations grew, so did the pressure to find new resources. The allure of gold, silver, and slaves in monasteries and cities along the coasts of Britain, Ireland, and France was simply too tempting. A single successful raid could transform a Viking warlord into one of the wealthiest men in Scandinavia. But raiding was risky. If defenders were strong, losses could be heavy. This led many Viking leaders to choose a more sustainable path: trade. For every Viking raid, there was an equally profitable trade expedition. Cities such as Hedeby, Birka, and Kaupang became international markets where Vikings exchanged their goods with merchants from as far away as Byzantium and the Abbasid Caliphate. Viking goods in the global market. Furs and walrus ivory, from the Arctic, highly prized in Europe and the Islamic world. Amber, collected from the Baltic coast, sought after for jewelry and religious artifacts. Slaves, captured from Eastern Europe and sold in markets as far as Baghdad. Silver and silk, brought back from the Middle East in exchange for weapons and timber. Stefan Brink, professor of Scandinavian studies at the University of Cambridge, in the Viking World. Vikings were not just traders, but middlemen. They connected civilizations, moving goods from the east to the west, reshaping medieval economies. These Viking trade networks helped fuel their military campaigns. A successful merchant could fund entire fleets, and a powerful warlord could use his plunder to establish new trading outposts. The two paths, raiding and trading, fed into each other. Judith Jesch, professor of Viking studies at the University of Nottingham, in the Viking diaspora. The Viking raids were not just military strikes, they were geopolitical events that forced Europe's rulers to change how they governed. Viking raids exposed the weaknesses of medieval kingdoms. In places like Anglo-Saxon England and the Frankish Empire, rulers quickly realized that their decentralized defenses could not withstand Viking attacks. This led to the rise of fortified castles. More stone keeps were built to resist Viking assaults. The professionalization of armies. Kings began training soldiers year-round instead of relying on peasant militias. The rise of new alliances. Rulers struck deals with Viking leaders, offering them land in exchange for peace. One of the most famous examples of this was the creation of Normandy. In 911 AD, the Frankish king Charles the Simple granted land to the Viking leader Rollo, creating a Norse-controlled territory in what is now France. Leslie Abrams, in early Normandy and the Viking World. The creation of Normandy showed that Vikings could transition from raiders to rulers. Their ability to negotiate and integrate into medieval power structures was just as remarkable as their military strength. By the late 10th century, Viking raids declined. The reasons were not simple, but several key factors contributed to the change. Stronger defenses, European kingdoms adapted, building better armies and fortifications. Christianization. As more Viking rulers converted, raiding Christian lands became politically unpopular. Integration into feudal systems. Many Vikings were no longer outsiders. They had become lords, nobles, and even kings. Neil Price in The Viking Way, Religion and War in Late Iron Age Scandinavia. The Viking way of life did not vanish. It evolved. Their ambitions shifted from plundering wealth to controlling it through land and political power. Vikings had not disappeared, but they had changed. The warriors who once raided monasteries were now building them. The warlords who once ruled from the deck of a longship now ruled from stone halls. Stefan Brink, in The Viking World. The true genius of the Vikings was their adaptability. They conquered with the sword, but they ruled with diplomacy and trade. Vikings were raiders, but also traders. They were warriors, but also kings. Their expeditions transformed the medieval world, not just through bloodshed, but through the exchange of goods, culture, and ideas. When we think of the Vikings, we imagine warriors, men clad in mail, brandishing axes and storming monasteries. But this is only part of their story. The same ships that carried them to war also carried them to bustling trade markets. The same hands that wielded swords counted silver coins. Stefan Brink, Professor of Scandinavian Studies at the University of Cambridge in The Viking World. Viking traders connected cultures from the North Atlantic to the Silk Roads, establishing a commercial empire that stretched farther than their swords ever could. Vikings did not raid just for the sake of destruction. They raided to acquire wealth, and that wealth needed markets. These markets spanned the known world, from the icy waters of the Baltic to the opulent bazaars of the Islamic caliphates. Norse were unafraid of foreign lands and cultures. They built a vast trading network that extended from the cold northern fjords to the bustling streets of Constantinople and Baghdad. This is the story of how Vikings became the middlemen of the medieval world. The Viking trade network spanned three major zones. The Western route, connecting Scandinavia to the British Isles, the Frankish kingdoms, and Iberia. The Eastern route, following the Russian rivers down to Byzantium and the Middle East. The Northern route, bringing Arctic resources like furs, ivory, and walrus tusks to mainland Europe. Unlike land-based traders, the Vikings used their superior shipbuilding skills to bypass dangerous overland routes, controlled by empires and warlords. Their ships could sail deep inland through rivers, allowing them to transport goods directly from the source to major trade hubs. The Vikings weren't just buyers or sellers, they were facilitators. They acted as middlemen between cultures, trading goods from one region to another. Major Viking trade commodities: furs and walrus ivory, hunted in the Arctic, prized in Europe and the Middle East. Amber, harvested from the Baltic, highly valued for jewelry and religious artifacts. Silver, the Vikings' preferred currency, acquired through trade and plunder. Silk and spices, brought back from the Islamic caliphates and the Byzantine Empire. Weapons and armor. Scandinavian steel was traded for gold, horses, and luxury goods. Slaves, one of the most controversial aspects of Viking trade. Captives from Eastern Europe were sold in markets as far as Baghdad. Judith Jesch, professor of Viking studies at the University of Nottingham in the Viking diaspora. The Vikings' commercial activities were not just about material gain. They played a vital role in shaping the very cultural fabric of medieval Europe. While many Vikings ventured westward to the British Isles and France, some of the most ambitious turned east. Using the great rivers of modern-day Russia, they established trade routes stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Neil Price, professor of archaeology at Uppsala University, in Children of Ash and Elm, A History of the Vikings. Few people realize the extent to which Vikings shaped the early history of Eastern Europe. They not only traded there, they ruled there. The Vikings who settled in these lands became known as the Rus, the very name that would later give rise to Russia. From Novgorod and Kiev, they traded with the Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate, exchanging northern goods for exotic treasures. The journey was treacherous. Vikings had to navigate dense forests, fend off hostile tribes, and portage their ships across dangerous terrain. But the rewards were immense. Byzantium and Baghdad were among the richest cities in the medieval world. Leslie Abrams in Early Normandy and the Viking World. The eastern trade routes turned Scandinavian warlords into merchant kings. The wealth they brought back transformed Viking society. The Vikings did not only bring goods back to Scandinavia, they brought ideas, technology, and culture. They borrowed from the people they traded with, assimilating new customs into Norse society. Judith Jesch in Ships and Men in the late Viking Age. The Vikings were cultural chameleons, adopting the best aspects of every civilization they encountered. Coinage and money systems. Viking traders began using silver dirhams from the Middle East, influencing Scandinavian currency. Byzantine and Islamic art. Norse jewelry adopted intricate Eastern patterns. Technology improved shipbuilding techniques from contact with the Mediterranean. Religious influence. Viking traders were exposed to Christianity and Islam, leading to later conversions. Stefan Brink in the Viking World. The Viking economy was not driven by war alone. It was fueled by trade, diplomacy, and an instinct for commerce that connected the medieval world in ways no one else could. By the end of the Viking Age, the Norse were no longer just feared raiders. They had become rulers, merchants, and global traders. Their trade networks stretched across continents, bringing prosperity and reshaping the economic map of medieval Europe. The Vikings are often portrayed as invaders, warriors who burned towns, plundered monasteries, and disappeared back into the sea. But their legacy is far greater than destruction. They were also settlers, traders, and diplomats, absorbing the cultures they encountered and leaving an indelible mark on Europe and beyond. Judith Jesch notes, the Vikings did not merely conquer, they adapted. Their ability to absorb local customs, languages, and traditions was a key to their long-term success. From the British Isles to the Byzantine Empire, from the rivers of Russia to the markets of Baghdad, the Vikings were not just takers, they were participants in the great cultural exchange of the medieval world. This is the story of how Viking expansion reshaped societies and how, in turn, the Vikings themselves were transformed. Nowhere was Viking influence felt more strongly than in the British Isles. At first, they arrived as raiders, striking monasteries and villages along the coasts, but soon they settled permanently, integrating with local populations. This assimilation is best seen in Danelaw, the Viking-controlled region of England. Here, Norse settlers adopted Old English words and customs while retaining Scandinavian legal traditions, established towns like York, Jorvik, which became a thriving Viking city, intermarried with local Saxon and Celtic populations, producing generations of Anglo-Scandinavian families. Even the English language bears the mark of the Vikings. Words like law, sky, egg, knife and window all have Norse origins. Judith Jesh in Ships and Men in the late Viking Age. The Vikings left their imprint not only on place names and dialects, but on the very fabric of English identity. The Vikings did not just adapt to English society, they did the same in France. The greatest example of this was Normandy. In 911 AD, Viking leader Rollo was granted land by the Frankish king Charles the Simple. In return, Rollo swore loyalty to the Frankish crown, creating the Duchy of Normandy. Leslie Abrams in Early Normandy and the Viking World. The Vikings who settled in Normandy did not remain outsiders for long. They adopted Frankish customs, became feudal lords, and within generations they were indistinguishable from the nobility they once raided. Within a century, the Norse of Normandy spoke Old French, not Old Norse. They adopted Christianity, abandoning pagan rituals. They built castles, churches, and monasteries in the Frankish style. While many Vikings sailed west, others turned east, navigating the great rivers of Russia. These Norse explorers, known as the Rus, became the rulers of early Russian states such as Novgorod and Kiev. Neil Price, Professor of Archaeology at Uppsala University in Children of Ash and Elm, A History of the Vikings. The Vikings who travelled east were not just traders. They founded cities, became kings, and laid the foundations of what would become Russia. The Rus Vikings adopted Slavic customs and language, forming a unique Norse-Slavic hybrid culture. Orthodox Christianity, which became the dominant faith of Russia. Byzantine military techniques, learning from the greatest empire of the time. Meanwhile, in Byzantium, modern-day Istanbul, Vikings found a different role. They became the elite bodyguards of the Byzantine emperor. Known as the Varangian Guard, these Norse warriors served as personal protectors of the emperor, feared for their unmatched loyalty and battle skill. Leslie Abrams in Byzantium and the Viking World. To the Byzantine emperors, the Norse were more than mercenaries. They were trusted warriors who stood at the very heart of imperial power. At the start of the Viking Age, Norsemen worshipped Odin, Thor and Freya, making blood sacrifices to the gods. But over time, through contact with Christian Europe and the Islamic world, their beliefs evolved. The Christianization of the Vikings. Many Vikings converted to Christianity through trade and diplomacy. Kings like Harald Bluetooth of Denmark and Olaf Tryggvason of Norway embraced the new faith. By the 11th century, Viking society was almost entirely Christian. Neil Price, in The Viking Way, Religion and War in Late Iron Age Scandinavia. The Viking conversion to Christianity was not immediate, nor was it forced. It was a gradual process shaped by trade, war, and the slow integration of Norse and Christian ideas. Even Viking art reflected this cultural fusion. Norse carvings began incorporating Christian crosses, Arabic calligraphy, and Byzantine motifs. Stefan Brink in The Viking World. The true genius of the Vikings was their adaptability. They conquered, but they also integrated. They ruled, but they also learned. Their legacy is found not just in war, but in culture, language, and identity. By the end of the Viking Age, the Norse had left their mark not only through swords, but through settlements, trade, and ideas. They had shaped kingdoms, influenced religions, and woven themselves into the fabric of European history. The Viking Age may have ended, but its impact has never faded. The Norsemen were not just raiders or traders, they were founders of kingdoms, shapers of cultures, and weavers of legends. Their influence can still be seen in the languages we speak, the cities they built, and the stories passed down through generations. But the story doesn't end here. If you want to continue exploring the Viking world, we invite you to watch our deep dive into Anglo-Saxon England, a land that fought against Viking invaders for centuries and was forever changed by their presence. Discover the battles, the heroes, and the struggle for dominance that defined an era. And if you're intrigued by the beliefs and myths of the Norsemen, don't miss our video on Norse mythology, where we unravel the epic tales of Odin, Thor, Loki, and the great cosmic battles that shaped the Viking worldview. Click now to watch. Let's continue this journey through history together.